Welcome to the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society. Welcome to ITSP Magazine. You're listening to a new Securing Bridges podcast. You're about to join Alyssa Miller as she sits down with senior and executive security leaders to share stories of success and failure while working across business teams. It's time to build and secure the bridge to the business. Knowledge is power, now more than ever.
All right, everybody, welcome aboard. It's yet another episode of Securing Bridges. I'm Alyssa Miller, and as you can see, I'm back on the road again, coming to you live from sunny New York. Believe it or not, it is actually sunny today. It's gorgeous here. So here we are, Securing Bridges. You know this show. We talk all about how do we bridge between the business and, say, maybe that software engineering organization or whatever our core competency is and our security team. Trying to make those conversations happen and draw business value from the things that we're doing in security. And so this week, I have a super cool guest. This just seemed like so perfect. If we're going to talk about how we bridge the gap between security and developers, I thought getting someone in here from Snyk would be great. So here he is with me today. It's Simon Maple. Hey, Simon, how are you?
Hey, Alyssa, I'm doing really, really well. And it's an absolute pleasure to do a podcast with you. So I'm really excited for the next, however long this is, to chat with you through this.
We'll go 35, 40. You're right. We didn't really tell you that beforehand.
Hours, days, minutes? What are we looking at here?
35, 40 minutes.
Minutes.
I wouldn't be quite hot for 45 days, but I would get tired. So, sorry, folks. Yeah, we do talk a little bit before we go live. But Simon, why don't you go ahead and just introduce yourself a little bit? I mentioned you work for Snyk, but, share a little bit more with us about what it is you do.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, like you said, my background is kind of like engineering, and when you're talking about bridging to developers, I think is great that you involve people from the engineering side. So my background, the last 20 years or so in engineering teams, being a developer in large enterprise organizations to developer advocacy and community. I've been at Snyk now for around 4 years and running the DevRel team and the community teams. And I've moved into a field CTO role, which kind of, it was one of those roles where you think, what is that role? I've never heard of that role before. It's a fairly new role, which I would probably say over the last few years is picking up speed a little bit, but it's really about looking at the market, looking at how people are dealing with a technology or a practice or process. So, for example, obviously I'm working for a security company. So, looking at how developers and security are working together, what the best practices are, what the pitfalls are, and really learning from others and sharing that knowledge across many of our customers and other folks in the community that we chat with.
Awesome. So one of the reasons, and for the benefit of our viewers, of course, that I thought getting Snyk in here would be really good. So first of all, full disclosure, those of you that don't know me, I used to work at Snyk. In fact, actually, I worked with Simon. He was like smart enough to hire me.
100%, absolutely.
I got to give myself a little, Seriously, the reason I thought Snyk would be great is because one of the key marketing messages, or at least it was at the time when I was there, was this idea of developer first focus. And so when we were talking about security, and the conversation was really, how do we focus more on the developers? And so when we start talking securing bridges, I thought, hey, this would be a great way to look at things, because honestly, it is something that I think is an important way to look at just how do we build security tooling and how do we get developers to adopt them? So let's start off with, is that still the message, and is that still kind of the mission of Snyk? And if so, tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, and it absolutely is, and it's one thing that has never wavered at Snyk, and even in some of our when we introduce Snyk in a lot of in a lot of places now, we actually show a slide that Gaipo, one of our founders, was one of the first slides that he always used to show people 6-7 years ago when Snyk was founded, and it pretty much carries the same message that we share today, which is, ultimately the way to scale security in a modern deployment and in modern development workflows is through developers. You need developers to take the responsibility and to take the ownership of the security of their code. And we're not at this point saying anyone needs to be a security expert in the dev team. But it is important to have developers being able to develop securely, and secure development and security are two vastly different things. Developers tend not to care about the depths of security, but they do care about a secure development process that allows them to develop their code in a secure way, while still being able to do what they consider to be their core job of actually delivering software fast. So yeah, it is absolutely kind of like one of our core mantras that security is a tool for developers. There are ways in which developers can take that easy path, which is also the secure path. And it's a Snyk mission to say, right, we want to enable you and empower you as much as we can with the tooling. It's not all about tooling, of course, but we want to, that's the kind of piece that we can contribute, and that's what we want to empower developers with. So yeah, for sure, that's continued to be our message, and I'm sure it will always be our message of developer security.
So as you're looking at the marketplace, then, I mean, obviously, working for a vendor, you kind of look at the marketplace with an eye for where are people headed, what are the trends, what can we do next? What are you seeing? I mean, is there kind of a trend that you're seeing because I mean, push left, that's something we've been talking about as far back as I can remember. Right. I mean, as far as my tech career goes back to when I was a developer, we were talking about push left with security and quality. And so what are you seeing that is new or different right now that either security is getting right or security is getting wrong still?
Yeah, and I think so. I think there's, when we say, like, anything shift left, push left, all that kind of thing is exactly what you said. It's a technique which is tried and tested from many years ago. Predates some of the more modern continuous delivery, CI/CD, DevOps kind of spaces. This is something which was waterfall like in its space. And I remember when I left university in the early 2000s and joined my first company, and our delivery pipelines, well, not pipelines, but our delivery cycles were between 1 to 2 years, right? And when we talk about pushing something left or shifting something left at that stage, it was something that would benefit us by months, and it was an efficiency play. And this is really important for us to kind of like recognize the difference between that and what we're trying to do with security, which, while we do want to do things earlier in the process, we're not thinking about an efficiency play where we're trying to shift huge amounts, save ourselves months by getting that early feedback. It's equally about the change of responsibility. And I think a lot of people get that right, and a lot of people get that wrong. There's a big mix there, I think, in that changing of the culture. And just shifting something left or doing something at a different time isn't necessarily changing the culture, just changing the time as to when you do something. So I'd say the change in culture is that giving the developer the ownership. And that means the developer, runs with the tools they want. They run when they want. They're not mandated to run at a specific time. If they want to run in IDE, if they run a run in CI, that's the way the team wants to do it. And I think rather than the kind of traditional auditor style of giving developers audits and reports that they need to go through, it's about providing them with those kind of like those developer style tools. And that's one of the core areas that we need to shift a mentality from and to. And I guess from my point of view, that's important as working for a vendor. But I think that's a core thing. I feel like one of the other things which we from a cultural point of view have to really address is this mechanism in which we kind of collaborate with each other from a sec to a dev. Like, joining those bridge, building that bridge between security and development. And I think one of the core things there is security and devs just plain don't have enough empathy for each other. And I think this is common across like most places that we we talk to. And I think having security teams recognize what the issues are that the developers are having the developers recognize it from the risk point of view, and actually coming together on some shared goals. This is, if we don't have these shared goals which dev and sec are both working towards, and then security in that respect aren't blocking the development team, they're actually helping them to achieve those shared goals with the security team. Those are some of the really core shifts that we're seeing. So I'd say culturally and tooling are really important trends that we're seeing in the market. One other trend, and this is an interesting one. Our betting is there's a lot pushing over to the AppSec and to the developers here, but where we look at the way the application is changing, where we see obviously cloud aspect as well as first party code, third party code aspect. So in terms of cloud security, container security, IAC, all that side, there's an interesting shift happening that we can see, where some we see is kind of like moving more into the cloud security team, others are moving more into the AppSec team and moving into the development team. So identifying where that's going to kind of go in future is going to be interesting. But we do see a trend with the code, which always ends up in Git workflows or developer workflows. So that's an interesting trend that we're seeing, more fitting into an AppSec flow. But yeah, as the app changes, it's going to be interesting to see how the security follows it.
Yeah, this is kind of cool because a lot of what you said is kind of reminiscent. A couple weeks ago, we had a guest on here, Jules Olgafer was on, and one of the things she talked about was the idea of a security empowered culture. And I thought that kind of matches up to what you were saying, where you're talking about, put these tools in the hands of the devs. And then, you touched on something that's real pet peeve for me. And that's that idea of, what does shared responsibility really mean? Because there's too many, in my opinion, security people running around saying, yeah, shared responsibility means everybody's responsible for security. Well, yeah, but it means more than that, because now security, as you kind of mentioned, you have to take on some responsibility for how do we make development and deployment more efficient. And so I think that's, seeing where we're starting to shift that way, and hearing that that's kind of a trend, whether it's necessity or innovation that's driving that, is a good sign. Are there specific things that you're seeing organizations start to dig into that are maybe different ways they're building their security program or how they're addressing it to kind of create that additional culture?
I mean, I think there's two things that I would say. I'll go one into process, but I want to kind of like start in culture. And I think there are a few ways in which the cultural the ways organizations are trying to address this cultural shift that they know they need to do to break down those silos between dev and sec. I can't it'd be amiss to not mention security champions programs here, and programs or ways in which devs and sec teams can engage. Security guilds is, and there might be some like slight naming overlap here, but security guilds is another way. Security focus teams, whereby you focus on a single problem and you pull different people in from different areas of the organization to fix that problem. And it's a short-term focus group just based on fixing a certain problem. I'm a massive fan of security champions. Done a lot of research into how they've worked effectively, how they sometimes don't work, and identifying what those patterns are. But just the understanding and the recognition of what devs need to do, what devs want to do, and then the security team kind of stepping in to help and assist them to actually achieve that is extremely important. But I'd say one area that is key to almost the success of this and developer adoption, those kind of things in general, is the understanding from the organization, enough empowerment from the leadership team to be able to say security is important to our business. And we're not just going to say that. We want our engineering teams to be able to dedicate time to do that. We know that if we just say, sure, this is important, but we're not actually going to give you the time or give you the things you need to actually perform your tasks successfully to actually achieve that goal, it's going to be one of those things that developers are going to say, yeah, I've got a million things on my list that I'm not going to get to, and that's going to be one of them. So having your leadership team actually add these requirements and say, look, if you want to do security, we want a security champion to add 10% of their role, or have 10% of their role dedicated to security tasks, security aspects. That then empowers the developer to say, look, I'm going to spend 10% of my time improving this pipeline, improving this process, adding this new thing in to the way to our workflows, or doing some triaging on our vulnerability backlog with the security team. All of these things take time, and I think it's really core for that leadership team to step in to do that. The second thing I was just going to mention is process, because I think, you know, I think you nailed it when you said, you know, the security team need to make it easier for the dev team, and it's all about fitting into the dev process. If it's pulling developers away from the dev process and the dev workflow, they'll find a way to ignore it, or they'll find a way to step away from that. So how can we add security in their existing processes? How do we add the right automations and you know, add things in where they want to, where they expect it to happen? If they're huge CI users, add it in CI. If they love GitHub checks or Bitbucket pipes or GitHub Actions, add it there where they expect it and where they want to see it.
Yeah, I can't remember if it might have even been somebody I saw on Gaipo's podcast at one point, but I picked up a term, and I think it fits here. It's that idea of meeting them where they live, right? Mm-hmm. Like, we know our engineers, they live in places like GitHub and ADO and Circle CI or other tools that they're leveraging as part of their pipeline. And so where we can, you know, DevOps is obviously about more than just automation. But that is an important component. And we had that comment that was up there from someone on LinkedIn about, yeah, security. We often get pushed out of this because devs don't want to deal with us because we're the department of no, or, you know, we're the ones that kind of come to the party and ruin everything. And, you know, so I think, and correct me if you think I'm wrong here, but I think like being able to come with that type of integration where instead of shoving a security tool at our engineers and saying, here, use this, we come with a tool that says, here, we want to plug this into what you've already built. Yeah. So is that kind of the focus that you're taking with that?
Absolutely. I think there are a couple of important considerations to make here. Number one is just exactly what you said. Like if the engineers want checks in GitHub or Bitbucket or Azure DevOps or Azure repos, whatever they're using, wherever they need it, it needs to integrate with that. The second thing, and I think this is a really important thing, is, you know, not to be that department of no, right? Which I think is an unfortunate term that was kind of given to the security groups. But the way to avoid that is not by changing everything and blocking your dev groups and annoying them by now adding these million steps in that they need to make, because that is really going to make a developer push back. So when you add these processes, it's really important to be no or low touch in terms of what you've added to that pipeline, what you've added to that process, because you can't go from 0 to 100 miles an hour instantly, right? It's about going at the speed at which your teams can adjust to the change and educate your teams at the pace in which you're adding these processes in. So that's one thing. And the second thing I'd say is also don't assume just because one team can, even in your organization, even your department, even just because one team can adopt security practices at a certain pace, that every single team can do exactly the same thing and want to consume it in the same way. So treat every team differently. Maybe you can group some up that act similarly, or want to, their technology maturity, their security maturity, DevSecOps maturity is similar, and that's really, really important. So, yeah, start with that low touch. So maybe, let's say we're adding pull request checks in as a good example, right? We don't want to block anything initially, right? Unless, you know, there is a space that we want to get to, which may include blocking, may not include blocking, but we don't want to block anything initially. We want, you know, as many checks as what they've got today. We can test, we can show the visibility, we can report, that's great, but we don't want to block anything because then we're slowing down developers. We don't want to regress the developer workflow. And then slowly add that education into, okay, what do we want to do first of all? Well, maybe we stop developers adding really critical, highly exploitable issues that have fixes in, or something. You know, we look at the most critical, most problematic issues, And then we actually start educating in terms of, okay, how can we find this early? How can we fix? What information tooling do we have available? And do developers have enough information that they can actually do that very, very quickly? And then we use this tooling more now as a governance model. And it's like, okay, how can we see when the guardrails, which we as a security team can put in, is not being followed by the developers, and what is the problem? And how can we address that problem? And that's the model that we need. And you will see, based on what is coming through the pipeline and what is still not being fixed or not being worked on, okay, don't consider the fact that you need to block it as the solution. What is missing earlier on? Why is a developer not doing that? What is a developer not testing? What is a developer not? Why is a developer not reacting to the results? That's the kind of more of the mindset, and you build up and dial up what the security guardrails need to be for those projects, and it'll be different per project, most likely, or based on the criticality, based on what it's the apps and services are serving. But that's a really important piece to the not just having these solutions where you want them, but for the adoption and for the developers to really be on board, it has to serve their purpose.
Yeah. And it's interesting because it kind of speaks to how the maturity of your security program ties into the maturity of your DevOps program. It's kind of funny because you mentioned the blocking and then that concept of breaking the build, right? And so I look at my organization, and unfortunately we've kind of conditioned. First of all, I've got an organization of engineers that are amazing. Like they actually really they buy into security, whether or not they like it. Is another question, but they do a lot of the things. And when we look at our DevOps pipeline, like they're trying to automate, and they are trying to automate things like breaking the build. And it was actually surprising to them when I was standing there telling them, no, don't break the build. You can put that in as like a catch-all and like the worst case scenario, but how do we get to a more mature state where breaking the build isn't the thing that we have to do? And I think one of those things, and let me know what you think of this idea, but I think as your CI/CD, you get closer to that world of CI/CD and become more mature toward that end, and now you know that you can release faster and faster and faster, that almost enables you to move away from breaking the build or having other gates like that, because now you've got that option of, well, I can deploy now, fix in the next cycle. Are you seeing that happen, or?
Yeah, no, and I think there are. So first of all, I think breaking the build. Sometimes there are such critical services that you just want to make sure that there are absolutely no particular types of vulnerabilities or even severity or priority scores on these vulnerabilities. You just don't want them to be anywhere near your production environment. And I think a lot of the time, we want all of our servers to kind of like be in that category when realistically they're not. And I think it's about, there's always a balance between that risk mitigation, real risk mitigation, and our innovation and speed of delivery. And I think there is absolutely a balance there in terms of, okay, if we put a specific type of vulnerability into our production environment, what's the risk of that, and what's the kind of realistic speeds that we want to eliminate that from our environment. I think we do see some of that, but I think one of the real I see that almost as, I don't want to say a failure in the shift left, but I see it as a way whereby there might be bigger reasons as to why something like that couldn't be solved earlier. There might be architectural reasons or problems with the way some of the dependencies are structured and things like that. I get that, and there are some times where you just think, what, we need to get this out, and these we have done some risk analysis, and we don't believe this to really be a very, very severe thing. We've probably got other things in production which are maybe more severe that we need to work on as well. But this isn't going to make anything that much worse. So that's a risk that we're willing to take. I kind of like sometimes think, okay, what are we missing earlier on that can actually stop that from even becoming a build break? When we think about our mentality of a CI/CD pipeline, we very often rely too much on the kind of like the CI part of that, in terms of we run all our tests in CI, and a lot of people who kind of like did much more security on the furthest right, and more in the runtime and places like that, they see CI as a very left step, but it's not. There are obviously many other places whereby a developer, as they're coding, a developer as they're building locally or checking in or doing a push into their local branch or whatever, there are so many places that these kind of things can be tested and be fixed before, that are actually so much cheaper for a developer to spend their time doing that. And I think there's an education and mindset that we need to do there. Like, if you compare it with quality, and I always think, security is just another type of quality test. It's exactly the same thing. We care about the quality of our code, which contains a huge number of different types of tests, security being one. And I think, when I joined IBM years ago, we had dev teams. I joined as a tester originally, so I was a functional tester, and we had test phases that I would write code in, and of course we tested way after the devs at the time would write their tests. And we matured as an organization and as teams to actually pull that in, and it took time. It took years to really educate and add that testing in, so that I would run a build locally, I would run my unit tests, I'll kick off my integration tests, so that when I actually push that through the pipeline, it's not going to break the build, because you didn't want to be that person that broke the build. And I think adding that mentality into the developer, so that it's a natural part of development, that's more the model that we need to be. So I think, there's a mix, and I think a couple of ways in which to think about it, probably at the same time, to be able to say, sometimes it's okay to actually push things into production if that's low sev, we've done risk mitigation, and we feel like it's okay with an SLA to fix this within 30 days or 10 days or a week or whatever, depending on the severity. But we also need to look further in terms of how did it get to this stage? How did we get here? But interesting cultural changes as well as process changes there that need to be addressed.
Well, you had mentioned governance before, right? And I think that's where governance becomes a key piece of this, is how do we measure it? And even what should we be measuring, or what should we be looking at? Because, it's great to sit there and we can count vulns, or we can count how many vulnerabilities we fixed, or, whatever. But that those measures kind of by themselves just feel a little thin. So as you're looking at that, you're trying to really gauge, okay, maybe things aren't going the way we had hoped, and we want to search why are our engineers not fixing these things sooner? What are some of the things that you're digging into there? Where are you looking to start to try to uncover some of that?
Yeah, I mean, I love behavioral measures rather than more operational measures in terms of what's the absolute number of vulnerabilities we have, because we know that's going to go down when we have time to fix, that's going to go up when we deliver huge amounts of code, right? And so it's like, one team might look great and another team might look bad, but actually one team has fixed one vulnerability, another team has added a couple more, but they've just doubled their code base size. And so what are we actually expecting here from the different teams? And I think so, to your point, and I know the paper that you wrote was excellent in terms of having those, I remember that paper you wrote, in terms of in terms of the almost like the relationships between numbers. So recognizing that, as something happens, like as number of commits, number of pull requests, etc., happens, yes, you should expect something to happen to the vulnerability number, which may not go down. It might jump up a little bit, but it might stay even, and it means different things. I love, like I say, the more behavioral metrics. So I love the idea of being able to say, in fact, I'll go back to one of the things I mentioned with the security champions programs. I spoke with a number of different organizations that do sec champions programs, and one of the core things which a number of teams did very, very well was scorecards. And when a developer became a security champion, what they did was they said, okay, let's fill out this scorecard initially, and you can almost like self-assess what you're doing, how you're doing it. And I think that's great for the developer to self-assess, or the team to self-assess. And then once they've done that, okay, the next thing is, okay, what do you want to improve? What is the most painful thing from your team that we as a security team can help with? And being able to almost, our core goal as security organizations or as businesses is to make sure we were better at security now. We've improved our security posture more today than we were yesterday. We're getting better. That's our goal, right? And so one of the great ways of being able to do that is say, well, actually, do you know what? Our behavior is changing. The way we are looking at this, the way we're addressing this is changing. And we can show this month over month, quarter over quarter, and you can see the areas which we're digging into. And I think metrics and things which we can look at could actually be behavioral as well. What is the average time for us when we introduce a vulnerability to fix it? What are the types of vulnerabilities that we're most interested in? Can we bring that specific type of vulnerability down? Or is there an education that we can introduce that will actually perform that, the right behavior that we want based on the areas of threat that we have? So for me, those are the very, very interesting areas. And I think Patrick Dubois, of course, the famed DevOps, godfather of DevOps, I think they once called him, or father of DevOps. One of the things that Patrick once did some interesting work around is this kind of like the 3 nines, 4 nines, 5 nines model that we tend to use more for a reliability or an uptime style model. One of the things that he was interested in there is based on our behavior. If we start at 100, how low does that get based on if our mean time to remediate, or if it drops below a certain SLA or something like that, then pieces drop, and we almost like rank our behavior over time based on the number of 9. So there are some interesting ways that I think that can be that are much better and much more realistic to what's happening in the organization than just operational metrics.
So can those metrics, as we build those, I mean, obviously we typically think of metrics as, okay, I can use this to measure success or whatnot. But now when you're talking, especially, you're talking about what Patrick's done, or even just in general sense, when you think about metrics, can that actually help us drive adoption? And like, actually, is there a way that can actually help encourage, rather than being so much of an oversight, actually make it something that's more proactive and motivates engineers?
I think there are numerous ways in which these kind of things can be done. And one of the things actually that some of the companies that I was speaking with, when they do these kind of scorecards, is they tend to have these scorecards per team, and they roll up into summary style scorecards by department, by group, by business unit, etc., etc. And these can be very transparent. So first of all, you can see how you're doing compared to other teams. You can see how you're doing compared to other departments and things like that. And developers care. They do care about what they do, and it's they don't want to be a team that is visually on the decline in terms of the trend in certain areas and things like that. So I think that's very important to be able to show that, and it really pulls out. I know some people will like gamification, some people don't. For those who do, it does pull on those kind of gamification strings, in that everyone wants to make sure that what they do is having an impact, and what they do is moving a needle in some space, and that's an important thing. I think also what they can do, which is really important, is allow a developer or a development team to be able to say, do you know what, we're going to prioritize security this over the next few sprints, not entirely dedicate them to security necessarily. I prefer it to be a part of sprints going forward, but we're going to increase or decrease, based on how that scorecard is looking. I always think it's okay for your security to go up and down, if you know about it and if you have reasons behind it, because these scorecards are best, in my opinion, when they're not just security scorecards, when they show the health really of the application in general. So your typical performance, your reliability, and all these other delivery of features and things like that. And so as your security is starting to look a little bit rocky, or if you want it to just improve it in general, in terms of over time the numbers, this gives development teams the ability to say, look, this is what we're doing, and this is why we're doing it. This is what we want to achieve, and it gives them the empowerment to say, this is why we're doing it. So I think that's very, very important. But there are even smaller things that I think can help that adoption. I love the celebrating success. I love the recognition that teams or developers can get from what they've achieved or what they can do. If a developer does something good, call them out in the team meeting, call them out in the department meeting, or whatever. Make sure there's a way that other development teams or other developers can follow what that person has done. So make sure it's documented, maybe, or help them to document it. How can we show other teams the success of this? If a team has introduced something, make sure that that's documented, make sure that's shareable to others that want to achieve the same thing. And of course, this is something which at the broader level, it needs to come from the engineers. It needs to come from the engineering teams. We can't just have the security team saying, look at this dev, weren't they great? It needs to come from a VP of engineering, a CTO, the director of engineering, to say, this is something important to us as a development organization and us as a business. We are recognizing this individual for what they did from the security side. And that carries huge amounts, shouts much more volume and carries much more water in terms of, an accomplishment and encouragement to other developers to do that, knowing they can get that recognition from their own part of the organization. So yeah, huge amounts of extra engagement you can get from the dev team through that and through metrics like you mentioned with scorecards and things like that as well.
No, that's awesome, and I love that we keep tying this. We keep coming back to that security champions program in particular. I know you mentioned that you had done a considerable amount of research. It's there's actually a lot of activity I'm aware of, and in fact, it's the first thing that I'm building as part of my security program now at S&P. And it's now I know you recently released the Security Champions Playbook at Snyk. And I know we're also getting close to the end of our time. So I thought one thing I'd like to ask, though, is there something we haven't really covered yet? Or what do you feel is like the really important thing that you and I haven't talked about yet that people might find in that playbook that they really should be checking out? I mean, what's like a core concept or something that really is just, if I want to be successful with a Security Champions program, what should I be looking at?
Yeah, I would say so. I think a couple that we've already discussed is one is that it's great to have that bottom up kind of like way of engage in making sure developers can get engaged in security, but it's really important to have that top down support. So I think having engineering teams engineering leads as well as security leads backing the programming and allow developers having time to do work in those programs is core. The second thing I was going to mention is scorecards. Getting people to do scorecards and self-assess is a great way to allow them to, in their security champions programs or groups, ask them the question, what do you want to do over the next quarter? What do you want to do? What's your goal as a dev team in the next half year? And then group them together with other security champions to be able to say, look, you've all got common goals. Let's work together as a small focus team or a small team to actually work out how we can accomplish this together. But I think one of the core things which goes without saying for any community, I think, but is really important to talk about in a security champions space is right at the start, we talked about how devs and security very often, they lack empathy for each other. They lack the perspective in terms of each other's opinion, each other's where we're coming from. I think one core aspect is when you're building a security champions program, always ask yourself, what's in it for the developer? The developer is your customer there. If you're building a program whereby you're asking the question, what can I get out of it as a security team? Or how can I benefit as a security team? You won't get a security champions program to actually be enjoyable for developers to actually join. You need to think, what is the value in the same way as like a community? Why would a community member join my community? What is the value that they're going to get from this community? And that's what, when you create your program and create your structure in, maybe it's monthly calls, maybe it's, weekly, maybe it's a education here and there. What is it that the developers want? Because if you can't provide them with the value, they'll tune out of the community. So I think at its core, that is one of the things which we felt very passionately about when talking with others and hearing very passionately from others about this. Get your developers involved in the program. Those are some of the core things for me that are important.
Cool. Well, I'm going to highlight one other thing you said in there. You kind of just subtly worked it in, but I've actually noticed some people kind of miss this when they think about security champions. That's just that idea of it being a true community.
Yeah.
Right? Like I've seen some organizations where they think about security champions and it's, oh, well, we're just going to train some developers in extra security topics and they're going to be our SMEs within those Scrum teams or whatever. And I think the real value comes in when you actually build that community where these engineers who are, your security experts within those teams are now sharing that information across, and they're discussing these topics and learning from each other. And then you kind of get that community thing going. I think that's like a crucial piece.
Oh, 100%. And I think it's, it's not a way for security to get a message across. It's not a way it's not a forum. It's none of that. It's the ability, you're winning when you get a developer ask a security question and a developer answers. That's when you're winning. And it's about enabling that. And it's about bringing those folks together. When you start getting that, you think, okay, let's build on this. Let's work out how we can do this more. But yeah, that's it is a community. So it's something that as a result needs nurturing. And it's not something that you can just assume if I just push a few things through it every month or every couple of weeks, it's going to continue to live. It needs continual nurturing, continual love to make sure, it's giving the developers and giving the teams the value they need.
Yeah, and that is like the perfect way to end it, because you mentioned it. You get a developer answering a developer on a security question. That's that culture that we were talking about at the very beginning of the show. And so I think this is a perfect way to wrap it up, because again, we probably could have gone on for 45 days. Things would be important. But no, it's been wonderful, Simon. I really appreciate you joining us today. I think it's been hopefully really impactful for people. I know I've actually learned quite a bit from the talk today, and hopefully all of you out there did too. Just a reminder, we'll be back here next week and every week. Give it a day or two. We'll have this up on podcasts. We are now available on all of the major podcast platforms: Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, you name it, we're out there. So if you don't want to watch the video replays, you can always subscribe to those podcast channels. Next week, we're going to have Andy Ellis on. So that's going to be another super exciting show for those of you that know who Andy is or maybe know him personally. I'm really looking forward to that conversation too. But this has been an amazing conversation today. So Simon, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. I will never say no to a chat with you, Alyssa. So anytime. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Awesome. Terrific. And to all of you, thank you for joining us. That's all the time we've got for today, but we'll see you next week right here on Securing Bridges. Take care.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Securing Bridges podcast with Alyssa Miller. If you learned something new and this podcast made you think, then share itspmagazine.com with your friends, family, and colleagues. If you represent a company and wish to associate your brand with our conversations, sponsor one or more of our podcast channels. We hope you will come back for more stories and follow us on our journey. You can always find us at the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society.